Hello, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm getting a bit blinded by the lights, so I apologize if I look a bit stunned. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session. Uh, Tanushree, I'll just briefly introduce the writers and the book that they are discussing primarily today. Tanushree spent 8 years in the corporate world before realizing spreadsheets were no match for stories. She wears many hats as a management graduate, an army wife, a grandmother, a traveler, and a storyteller. These experiences have fueled 35 plus books that dive into military life, history, crime, and the adventures of spirited young characters. Many of her stories have also made it to stage and screen, I beg your pardon, including Boots, Bells, Berets as the series Cadets. And this is a bit about the book, Bimbisar's Curse, that Tanushree will be discussing today. In 543 BC, in the kingdom of Magad, Bimbisar is born into a world teeming with ambition, power struggles, and intrigue. At just 15 years of age, he inherits a throne shadowed by his father's defeat. The kingdom of Magad teeters between chaos and opportunity. I'll move on to Satyarth. Satyarth Nayak is the best-selling author of the magnum opus Mahagatha, 100 Tales from the Puranas. It's an epic collection of 100 of the greatest mythological stories of gods, goddesses, asuras, sages, and kings, handpicked from ancient Hindu Puranas, Satyayug, and ends in Kali Yuga. Published by HarperCollins, the book has become a national bestseller, crossing 1 lakh copies. Lauded by media for imparting lessons for our understanding of humanity and translated into multiple languages, including Chinese, this book has done extremely well. Satyarth's previous best-selling book was a biography of Sri Devi called The Eternal Screen Goddess. Let's move on to the questions. The first question that I want to ask is about historical fiction. So both historical fiction and Tanushree's book is an example of that, as well as mythological fiction. They have both been enjoying a sort of heyday or a revival or great popularity. And my first question would be in terms of why do you think that's happening? So just a brief interlude or a brief sort of, so like when I studied history in primary school, and I'm sure this must have been true for many of you as well, the primary school textbooks of history tended to tell us stories about the characters in a particular setting, so they were fun to read. But by the time I moved on to high school, it became less story and more sorts of, just having to mug up a whole bunch of facts and dates, and then history became a lot less interesting. And so I wanted to ask you why you think that historical fiction and mythological fiction are having a revival, and how do you approach the task of making it relevant and interesting for a contemporary audience?
Uh, as far as relevance is concerned, I don't know how many of the people present here really read historical fiction. Does anyone read historical fiction? Oh, wow, that's great. Nice to know, because I write a lot of historical fiction. Nurjan's Daughter was the first one that I wrote, which is still selling and is really made me think, yes, people do read historical fiction. And as far as Bimbisar is concerned, I don't know how many of you have heard of his name at all. Have you heard of Bimbisar? Okay, some hands going up. Because most of the history that is written is basically, what we see and read mostly is from the Guptas. Starts from, Chandragupta and all that era. The ones that Haryanka dynasty, which came much before them, is hardly mentioned anywhere. And so Bimbisar, Ajatashatru, these were like, the pioneers of the Magad kingdom. That time it was not even known as Magad kingdom as such, but they built it up. And Bimbisar was the first one. So basically, I think the revival is more so because we are suddenly turning towards our past. There has been a lot of interest these days to, go into the past, know about our culture, what we were, how we were, before we, started thinking about the British and the Mughals. So that has brought in the revival. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think think it does so very much. Maybe the same question to you as well, Satyarth. Why do you think that? So, like personally speaking, I feel extremely deracinated, and I'm very ashamed of that. And I've been trying lately to reconnect to my own culture and to my own languages. But what do you think is driving this thirst for getting back in touch with one's own culture, one's own mythology, especially I think among the young audience today?
I think I would attribute that to the fact that we have moved from joint families to more nuclear families. You know, in our families, a lot of us here will agree that we always had a layer of storytellers. We always had grandparents telling us those stories. But today's generation, a lot of households, they lack that layer. So then they are curious. They want to know what are these stories of our past. You know, what are the stories of our gods and goddesses or our kings and queens? So they look for storytellers, and I think that is the vacuum that this genre is filling up with the kind of writers that we have seen. And of course, Mahabharata being the latest entrant in that vacuum. So I think it is that vacuum that is, vacuums tend to attract and to suck. So they are sucking these readers into that zone. Also, I think it would be extremely pompous for me to say that I am reviving Hindu mythology or I am bringing it, giving it any sort of lease of life. Hindu mythology, our Purans, our Veds, they have a life of their own. They have always been there, and they are full of rich treasures of stories, and there's so much wisdom in these books that it just needs to be tapped. It just needs to be entered and relished. For me, I thankfully had a grandfather who instilled that love for Maithu in me. So for me, it was a beautiful process of osmosis, sitting in his lap and hearing all those stories. So when I grew up, the idea was to explore more. Is there a lot more that one doesn't know? And when I entered the world of the Purans, it was staggering. It's entering a multiverse of, we have 36 Purans. Let that number first sink in. There are 18 Mahapurans and 18 Upapurans. So first of all, it's a universe, it's a multiverse. And then when you enter the stories, the figures, the characters, the events, it's epic. It's Rowling meets Game of the Thrones meets Lord of the Rings meets all of that together and 10 times more. So it is that kind of universe. So for me, I was lost. And then the idea came, why don't I put out the best stories from these epics for readers like me who want to know? And so that is where the genesis of Mahabharata happened.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Just as a quick point of interest for myself, how many of you grew up hearing retellings of the myths from your family members, like grandparents, parents? So less than half of you? Cool. And for people in the audience who read mythological fiction, I'd love to find out a bit later, how you got into that, whether it's because you did or did not hear myths from your family members and wanted to dig a little deeper.
So basically, we are all panelists today for you.
No, because
that's great. So it's always wonderful.
I just went a bit off script because, I grew up in a firmly atheistic family, and I was told zero stories about my own myth, and so I had to go out and read the Ramayana by myself when I was in my 20s, and then I felt this distance between me and my culture. But to get back on script now, and to get back to our actual two panelists, how do you approach the process of researching and of preparing story, especially one for which, as I think you've told me earlier, there was not much in the historical record that was trustworthy, or that was, there was not much information, and you had to sort of build the story as you went, or flesh it out, and to enliven the characters. So for you, what is that process of doing the research and then filling in the gaps, deciding where to take creative liberties? What does that process look like for you for historical fiction?
See, writing this book has been a tremendous learning for me, because this is about the 500 BCs. Just imagine, we are in 2025 now, and this is 500 BC. So there was hardly any documentation at that time, and whatever we had was actually in the form of religious texts. And what I got is from, that was the time of Buddha and Mahavira. Both Mahavira was about to end, means he was passing away almost around that time, and Buddha has just emerged. So this is the time when Bimbisar came into being, and he was initially Mahavir's follower, but he was very impressed by Buddha's teachings. Now, there's a lot of controversy. The Jains have put it, they have the stories in their own religious texts, but that is very different from the one that the Buddhists say. So, according to the Buddhists, his son really tortured him, just for the throne. But the Jainas are actually saying, no, Ajatashatru did not torture him because Ajatashatru was a fervent Jain initially. Then later he became a Buddhist. So there was this controversy that I had to handle. There was this striking of balance, choosing what retelling I was to do. But that made it all the more challenging and interesting. So I struck a note which I thought was most logical. But the researching part was actually through mostly these religious texts, because historically there's very little. Because we know about Amrapali, she has been written much about, and I have written Ambapali earlier. So it was that book which generated a lot of interest in people, and so Bimbisar being her lover, automatically, organically became important for me to write his life. So that's how I approached the book.
Just a short note to the audience. Ambapali is the courtesan or the Samvadhu.
Vaishali is
Or
Nagarvadhu.
Vaishali. So she is one of the many mates of Bimbisar. So that is the context in which she enters this story as well. Tanu, you mentioned that there were sort of competing versions of the story of Bimbisar, especially with respect to how his son usurped him and got the throne. And I'm sure that challenge would have been multiplied since you would have had many, many versions of the same myths to choose from. So how did you go about the process of deciding which version, or whether to combine versions, or even, first of all, which of the thousands of myths that you wanted to include in your book? Like, what was that process of selection or compositing or narrowing down like for you?
No, it was quite a process, because like you said, there were thousands of stories to choose from. So I had to set some sort of a filter. So my plan was, I created a three-pronged approach. There was a three-layer filter there. First of all, the stories had to be interesting, period. It had to be a story that lingers in your mind long after you've laid the book to rest. A story that you mentally engage with after you have laid it down, and the beauty about Hindu Purans is that it's very postmodernist in its approach, that is no one single truth that they expound. Every person who reads it will come up with his own truth, his own interpretation based on his worldview and his conscience, his mindset. So stories that engage you in that interesting way, that was the most important aspect of choosing the stories. Secondly, who were the characters involved, the gods and the goddesses, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, the Asuras, the Devis, the kings, Chandravanshi rulers, Suryavanshi rulers. So who were the interesting characters, that kind of embellish the story? That again was very important for me. And if it was a lesser known story that deserved a wider audience. Because there's so much in Purans that one doesn't know about. I mean, to give you a very quick example, how many of you have actually read Mahabharata? I mean, so it's interesting. It's a fresh audience. So there's a story that I discovered when I was reading the Purans, and I was like, this story needed a wider audience. It was the story of a lady called Swaha. Now, it so happens one day that the gods, they all come to Brahma and say that we are famished, we have nothing to eat. So Brahma says, how's that possible? I've made a very proper symbiotic system, where when human beings on earth, when they do a yajna and they pour havish, the offerings that are poured into the fire, Agni makes the transfer. So whatever is poured as offering by the humans, that is supposed to reach you as your food. So how can you be famished? Because there's so many yajnas happening on earth. Agni comes forward and folds his hands and says, I don't seem to have the agency to make that transfer possible. So then Brahma scratches his three heads. What do we do? And then Brahma consults Prakriti, that's Mother Nature. And Prakriti creates a goddess. And, and Prakriti says, from now on, this goddess shall be that cosmic conduit. She will make the transfer possible. Brahma says, what has Prakriti named you? And the goddess replies, she calls me Swaha. So Brahma makes a rule that from now on, whenever a yajna happens and mantras are chanted, every mantra must end with the word Swaha, which is a practice that we all are familiar with. You always hear in every yajna, something, Swaha. So Swaha is that agency that makes the transfer possible. And Brahma says that, any mantra that is chanted without swaha would be like a snake without a poison, or a man without knowledge. So just something so simple as this, an everyday practice that one has heard about or indulged in, to actually find out the source that it comes from and how it celebrates the feminine, how it's a goddess who comes to the rescue of these alpha male gods who stand completely helpless, and it's Prakriti and it's Swaha who come to their rescue. So those stories which are so hardly known, they deserve a wider spotlight like this that's blinding us here. So I think that's the reason why Mahagatha happened.
I think that was a beautiful example. I mean, I encountered so many stories in Mahagatha that I had not heard at all, and this, I think, is a particularly beautiful example of a story where you are taking a tale that's lesser known, but you're linking it with something, with a word that everyone would have heard at the end of every mantra. So that's a great example of your selection strategy for deciding on the pieces to be included in this book. I wanted to ask you, so the title of the session being Ancient Curses, I wanted to ask you next about that. No spoilers, don't worry, but in Tanu's novel, Bimbisar's Curse, so there is a sort of dynastic, intergenerational sort of trauma or sort of crime that happens, and the genesis of that in Tanu's reimagining of this not that well-researched, not that well-documented dynasty is that there's a curse. So the king does something and then he gets a curse. Bimbisar does something and then he's cursed by somebody, and then that curse ends up having bad effects on him and his whole dynasty. And so I wanted to ask you, Tanu, how did you approach the concept of cursing? And could you also tell us a bit about what would cursing have meant for someone living in 500 BC in the Haryanka dynasty or in the Magad kingdom? What kind of sense would they have made of this sort of idea that you can wish somebody ill and the gods will stand behind that and they will make it be so?
The Haryanka dynasty has a very, strange happening. Almost 6 generations of kings were killed by their own sons. Bimbisar was killed by Ajatashatru. Ajatashatru was killed by Udayin. Udayin was killed by his own son, and so on, so forth. The entire dynasty died with the fathers being killed by their sons.
I thought the Mughals invented that.
No.
Oh, the Greeks, the Greek gods.
That's what you get to
I was
hear
familiar
these
with.
days. That's what you get to hear these days.
Yeah, it's very strange. I had never heard of patricide in India to that extent that each generation repeated the same thing. So it got me thinking that there had to be something more stronger than, just the lure of the throne. Because in case of Bimbisar, he had already coronated his son. And he had said, okay, you go and become the king. And still he imprisoned him and he tortured him and he killed him. So what was the reason? And same thing, Ajatashatru lived in fear throughout his life, and of course compounded by guilt, because he felt, what if my son does the same? So he always lived in fear, and it happened. His son went and killed him. So the basic norm that one would think is that it was a greed for the throne, but then no, it could be something beyond that. So I thought, and that is where I took my creative liberty, that I put a curse on the generation, which was actually Bimbisar went to take revenge for his father's defeat from the Anga king, and he killed the Anga king in a very miserable condition. And when he killed him, Anga queen cursed him, saying, you have killed him because of your father's revenge. Just beware, your son will kill you and your entire dynasty will vanish. And that is exactly what happened. So in my imagination, maybe it was a curse. And yes, like you said, ancient times, the curse mattered much more. Today, we don't really give it that much importance. Someone says, okay, you'll go to hell. Okay, fine. He just said it because he's angry. But those days, it mattered. It created a fear psychosis. Even if it didn't come true, I think psychologically, people were affected by it.
Sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, perhaps.
Yes.
Just a note to the audience, this was not a spoiler. The story follows a sort of non-linear structure. So the first chapter opens with Bimbisar when he is an older man, sort of already imprisoned by Ajatashatru. And then the story goes back in time, and then you find out what happened to have him land up there. So this was not a spoiler. So don't worry, please go and read the book after this session. What I want to ask you, Satyarth, is that there are many examples from the Puranas where somebody curses somebody else. A god might curse a human being or vice versa. But there are also many cases where a curse might unintentionally have a positive effect down the line, and then vice versa. A boon might end up hurting the person that it was supposed to help. So what is your understanding of where that comes from, the significance of how this happens, and maybe a couple of examples that stand out to you in terms of when a boon has worked as a curse or vice versa?
We all talk about 50 Shades of Grey. The Puranas have 500 shades of grey. And within that reside these so-called curses and boons. And what is fascinating when you hear about them is that you come across stories where boons actually end up doing a lot more harm and curses actually end up doing something good. So this extremely grey world of the Purans, where there are no rules, it's very as a very postmodernist in its approach, very in terms of, and see, our mytho, our Brahmand is anyways extremely Newtonian in nature. The whole concept of karma is Newtonian. As you do, so shall you reap. So curses and boons kind of add on to that. That's another layer where you do something and you face the consequence, whether it's a good or a bad consequence. But you're right, like you said, there are many curses, and curses are reviled unfairly. There are many curses that have led to the good of humanity in mythology. I mean, the churning of the ocean that led to the coming of the 14 Ratnas and then the emergence of goddess Lakshmi, it happened because of a curse. The concept of, for example, the Dash avatars of Vishnu, who came down on earth for the good of humanity, that happened because of a curse. So those are very interesting stories. I mean, for example, and what is also interesting about Lord Vishnu, if you see his trajectory, in every yuga he is cursed, and in every yuga he has accepted that curse with the greatest of humilities. See, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh are divided as the creator, preserver, and the destroyer. So for Vishnu, it is a task of preservation. And for preservation, his concept has always been of greater good. So for the sake of greater good, if something unpleasant has to be done, he has done that and he has been cursed. In Satyuga, for example, he beheads the mother of a saint because the mother was harboring demons in her hermitage. So Vishnu tries to reason with her that, these are demons, these are asuras that need to be killed. But the mother says that my son is their guru. Shukracharya is the guru of the demons, and I'm Shukracharya's mother. And they have come here looking for sanctuary. So she also had a potent argument that I cannot let you, kill them. So Vishnu reasons with her, ultimately beheads her. When that happens, Bhrigu comes, who is the husband of the lady called Kavya Mata, and Bhrigu curses Vishnu that the way you force us to undergo, emotions of sadness and pain and separation, you will undergo all of that in the human form when you take avatars on earth. So that's how Vishnu's avatars happened. He accepted that curse with the greatest of humility. That was Satyuga. In Treta Yuga, you have a demon called Jalandhar who can only be killed if his wife Vrinda's chastity is destroyed. Because Jalandhar's power comes from Vrinda's chastity. And it falls upon Vishnu, that very unpleasant task of doing that, especially when Vrinda is supposed to be Vishnu's greatest devotee. But Vishnu had to do that for greater good. Vrinda curses Vishnu, that the way you separated me from my love, your love will be separated from you. And that happens in Ramayana, when Ram and Sita are separated from each other. So again, a curse that Vishnu accepts. And finally, in Dwapar Yuga, Vishnu is cursed by Gandhari, when as Krishna, he oversees the battle that kills 100 sons. So every yuga, Vishnu has been cursed and he has accepted that for the sake of the greater good. So the way that works, and the way, like I said, curses go on to actually do something good, that I think is an extremely fascinating aspect of the Puranas that one discovers when you read them. And there's a lot more in Mahabharata that you'll discover when you read those stories.
We have just about 40 seconds, 35 for one question. If anybody in the audience has any questions for Tanushree or for Satyarth. The clock is literally ticking down. I'm sure someone has a question.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts on modern myth making and what you think the present generation's myths would be, and how it would potentially be perceived in the future generations, say 5,000 years later.
Is that question for Satyarth?
I would like to hear both of your opinions if that's possible.
We're out of time, so maybe very quickly.
Okay, I'll just give you in just a couple of seconds. Are we not talking about Bimbisar's curse about 2,500 years later? So I guess stories will always be there, and someone like us will retell them in their own method.
Thank you so much, and be sure to pick up Bimbisar's Curse and Mahagatha at the bookstore and get them signed by the authors as well.
Tanushree, thank you, Satyarth.